In the small town of Gwyn, Alabama, Melinda Kern once brought laughter and warmth to her family, a seemingly peaceful portrait of kinship and faith in happiness. But beneath that serene facade lay terrifying cracks, a social media romance that turned into a living hell. Where Marco Deshawn Clark controlled, threatened, and transformed love into a deadly tragedy. The irony was that just 5 days before the tragedy struck, Melinda had been granted a 10-year protective order. But due to negligence in serving the order, it never reached the hands of the violent perpetrator. So, what led to this tragedy? Why did a woman who did everything to save herself still fail to escape the man she once called her husband? Summer mornings in Gwyn, Alabama always began with the chirping of birds and the scent of jasmine from Mrs. Turner's garden. In this small town of just 2,000 residents, everyone knew each other, and Melinda Kern was one of the most beloved figures. With her radiant smile and lively, humorous personality, she was always the center of attention at family gatherings and community events. In 2019, at the age of 37, Melinda had already experienced many ups and downs in life. But from a young age, she had shown a kind-hearted and deeply compassionate nature. Neighbors often recounted how she cared for injured stray animals or volunteered to help struggling families in the town without expecting anything in return. When she decided to move to Jonesboro, Arkansas, Melinda carried with her a heavy but sacred responsibility, caring for her mother. Mitzi. Their small home in Jonesboro became a place where mother and daughter faced Mitzi's final days together. Melinda devoted all her time and love to ensuring her mother's last moments were peaceful and comforting. Right next door lived Melinda's aunt, creating a warm and tightly knit family environment. However, 2018 marked a heartbreaking turning point in Melinda's life. The passing of Mitzi shattered her world. Her gentle mother, who had always been her source of strength and motivation, was gone. The grief left Melinda feeling lost, as if a part of herself had died with her mother in those dark months. Melinda found a glimmer of light through an unexpected relationship. In 2017, via social media, she met Marco Deshawn Clark, often called Cole. At first, Marco appeared as a caring, understanding man with whom she could share her pain and find solace. He listened to Melinda's story, showed empathy for her hardships, and gradually became an important source of emotional support. Their relationship progressed quickly, perhaps because Melinda was at her most vulnerable. By March 2019, just a year after her mother's death, Melinda and Marco decided to marry. They moved in together in a house in Lake City, Arkansas, where Melinda hoped to start a new chapter in her life. From the outside, it seemed like a beautiful love story, a woman finding happiness after loss. But the reality behind the walls of their Lake City home was entirely different. The early months of Melinda and Marco's marriage appeared normal, even happy at times. However, beneath that mask was a completely different person, a man with controlling and violent tendencies that gradually revealed themselves. The first signs of trouble emerged in late 2017, just months after their relationship began. Marco became unreasonably suspicious of Melinda's daily activities. He demanded detailed reports on where she went, who she met, and what she did throughout the day. At first, Melinda thought this was merely a sign of excessive love and concern, but she soon realized it was systematic control. November 2017 marked a dark turning point in their relationship. It was the first time Marco displayed serious physical violence. In a fit of rage, suspecting Melinda of hiding something, Marco did something she would never forget. He pressed a handgun into her mouth, the cold metal against her lips, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and Marco's crazed eyes etched themselves into Melinda's memory. In that moment, she understood she was living with someone capable of killing her at any time. But this was only the beginning of an escalating pattern of threats and violence. Marco frequently forced Melinda to kneel on the bathroom floor, an act meant to assert absolute dominance and humiliate her. During these episodes, he would stand over her, shouting horrific threats about what he would do if she dared to betray or disobey him. Strangulation became Marco's regular disciplinary method. Whenever he felt Melinda was not complying with his demands, he would grip her throat with both hands until she struggled to breathe, her eyes bulging as she felt death closing in. Then he would release her, watching her gasp and cough, before coldly laughing and saying, "Next time, you won't be so lucky." Marco's threats extended beyond physical violence. He frequently described in chilling detail how he would chop off Melinda's limbs if she ever tried to leave him. These were not impulsive outbursts, but calculated, deliberate statements, as if he had meticulously planned every detail. He also threatened to harm those close to Melinda, including her children and close friends, ensuring she would never find a safe haven. Most terrifying was Marco's chilling confidence when he declared he wasn't afraid of the police. He repeatedly told Melinda that even if he were arrested or imprisoned, he would find a way to come back and deal with her. "You think I'm scared of jail? I'll get out and find you no matter what," was a phrase Melinda heard over and over, like a daily curse. Marco's control wasn't limited to violence. He also isolated Melinda from the outside world. He gradually severed her connections with friends and family by starting arguments when visitors came or forbidding her from participating in social activities. Melinda found herself increasingly alone, with Marco as the only presence in her life, exactly as he intended. The situation worsened when Marco developed a delusional obsession that Melinda was cheating on him. He falsely accused her of sending nude photos to male colleagues, a baseless claim that became his justification for escalating violence. Each time Melinda denied the accusations, Marco grew more ferocious, treating her denials as proof of her guilt. Cindy Davis, Melinda's close friend, later refuted Marco's accusations entirely. She insisted that Melinda was an honest, family-oriented woman who would never engage in the infidelity Marco alleged. In fact, Cindy noted, it was Marco who had suspicious relationships outside the marriage. But he projected his guilt onto Melinda to justify his actions. By early 2019, Melinda was living in constant fear. She genuinely believed Marco would kill her and her family, a belief grounded not in paranoia, but in the specific threats and violent acts she had endured. Each day felt like living with a ticking time bomb, never knowing when Marco would act on his horrific threats. This situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Melinda knew she had to act to protect herself and her loved ones. But with someone like Marco who claimed to fear no law and vowed to hunt her down, escaping this relationship became a life-or-death challenge. What happened next would prove that Melinda's fears about Marco were not baseless, but a chillingly accurate premonition of the tragedy to come. August 7, 2019 marked a critical moment in Melinda's fight for survival. The Craighead County Sheriff's Department intervened, forcing Marco to leave the Lake City home. This was the result of domestic violence reports Melinda bravely filed. Despite Marco's terrifying threats of retaliation if she betrayed him, however, Marco's removal from the home did not bring Melinda a sense of safety. On the contrary, she knew it was only the beginning of a more dangerous phase. His threats to find her at all costs echoed in her mind, prompting her to decide against staying in the home they had shared. Melinda quickly packed essential belongings and fled to a relative's house, hoping for temporary shelter, aware that Marco could track her through her familiar car. Melinda made a smart move. She traded her vehicle for a different one in Missouri. This tactical decision aimed to cover her tracks and make it harder for Marco to find her. Every move Melinda made was calculated with care, as if she were evading a dangerous predator. On August 19, 2019, just 5 days before the tragedy, Melinda was granted an official protective order by the court. This long-term order, valid for 10 years. From August the 19th of 2019 to August the 19th, 2029, strictly prohibited Marco from contacting, approaching, or messaging Melinda in any form. To Melinda, This order was like a legal shield, the final barrier between her and the man who had threatened to kill her. Yet fate dealt a cruel blow. The police failed to serve the protective order to Marco, whether due to his frequent changes of address to avoid detection or administrative oversights. The result was that Marco remained unaware of the order's existence. More critically, he faced no legal consequences for violating it. This grave error left Melinda in a vulnerable state she was unaware of, while Melinda believed she had the law's protection. Marco was quietly plotting a sinister scheme. He devised a cunning plan to lure Melinda back to the Lake City house, where he could control the situation entirely. Marco contacted Melinda's workplace and disabled her payroll card, creating a situation that forced her to return home to retrieve a new card sent by mail, August 24, 2019. A day Melinda thought would be a quick trip to pick up mail and take out the trash became the last day of her life, unaware that Marco was lying in wait. Melinda drove to the old house in a calm state of mind, perhaps even feeling relieved. Believing she had escaped her abuser's clutches, Marco had meticulously prepared for this moment. He hid inside the trailer with the windows open, creating a vantage point to watch the street and spot Melinda's arrival. In his hand was the Taurus semi-automatic handgun, the same weapon he had used to threaten her in the past. Now, it was no longer just a tool of intimidation, but was about to become a true murder weapon. When Melinda's car appeared, and she stepped out to park in the yard, Marco emerged from the trailer to confront her, according to his later statement to the police. He initially intended to talk to resolve things, but this claim starkly contradicted his actions, preparing a loaded gun and luring Melinda back to the house. Upon seeing Marco, Melinda's survival instincts kicked in. She tried to flee and screamed for her aunt, who was at the neighboring house. In that moment, Melinda likely hoped her cries for help would draw attention and prevent the worst. But Marco gave her no chance. 5 gunshots rang out in the quiet neighborhood, shattering the peace of an ordinary summer day. One bullet struck Melinda's arm. Another pierced her back. She collapsed in the front yard of her aunt's house, blood pooling from her wounds, staining the ground where she once played as a child. After committing the brutal act, Marco grabbed Melinda's car keys and fled the scene in a white Dodge Charger. According to witnesses, he sped away at high speed, as if escaping the consequences of his actions. In her final moments, Melinda screamed in desperation, perhaps a last call for help or a farewell to the world. Her aunt and nearby neighbors found her shortly after, but it was too late to save her. The gunshots in Lake City immediately drew the attention of neighbors. Within minutes, police arrived at the scene, where they found Melinda Kern's body lying in a pool of blood in the front yard. This was not a complex case requiring extensive time to identify the perpetrator from the very first minutes. Investigators gathered crucial clues from witness statements. Melinda's aunt, who witnessed the entire tragedy from her window, became the key witness. She provided police with a detailed description of Marco Deshawn Clark and recounted the history of violence Melinda had endured. Her testimony not only identified the perpetrator, but also provided context for the motive. Other neighbors confirmed seeing a man matching Marco's description fleeing the scene in a white Dodge Charger shortly after the shots were heard. However, what made the investigation unique was not the identification of the perpetrator, but the bizarre actions Marco took immediately after the crime. Instead of fleeing and covering his tracks like most criminals, Marco behaved as if he wanted the world to know what he had done. The first call Marco made after killing Melinda was to Cindy Davis, her close friend. In a cold, remorseless tone, he bluntly confessed to Cindy that he had shot Melinda dead. Despite her panic and fear, Cindy was composed enough to note his confession and later provided the police with critical information, including Marco's phone number. Marco's subsequent actions further revealed the disturbed psyche of a killer. He accessed Melinda's Facebook account, possibly using her phone or login credentials he knew, and began posting threatening videos. In these videos, Marco not only admitted to killing Melinda, but also threatened to kill others. His primary target was a male colleague. He falsely believed Melinda was having an affair with a baseless accusation that fueled his warped motives. Marco also used Melinda's Facebook account to send provocative and threatening messages to her stepmother and close friends. These messages not only deepened the pain of those grieving Melinda's death, but also demonstrated Marco's cruelty and lack of humanity. It was as if he wanted to prolong the suffering of those around Melinda, even after taking her life, beyond exploiting the victim's Facebook account. Marco called another acquaintance, continuing to threaten more killings and showing no remorse for his actions. These calls were recorded and became critical evidence of his mindset and intentions post-crime, using the phone number provided by Cindy Davis. The police began efforts to contact Marco. The first call was surprisingly successful. Marco answered immediately. However, upon realizing it was the police, he promptly hung up. This showed that, despite his erratic mental state, he was still alert enough to recognize the danger of engaging with authorities. The police persisted, calling Marco 4 more times, each time employing different negotiation tactics. Finally, after persistent efforts, they convinced Marco to surrender at the police station. His decision to turn himself in may have stemmed from various factors. Perhaps he realized escape was futile, or maybe his threatening videos and calls had satisfied some part of his disturbed psyche. The surrender proceeded unexpectedly smoothly. The police instructed Marco to park in front of the deputy's vehicle, raise his hands, and position himself for clear visibility. Surprisingly, Marco followed these instructions without incident. There was no shootout, no chase, and no resistance. He surrendered coldly and calmly, as if the murder was merely a task he had completed. Upon his arrest, Marco was taken to the station for questioning. In the interrogation room, he openly admitted to shooting Melinda with the Taurus handgun. However, when asked about the weapon's whereabouts, he claimed to have discarded it along the road near Raven. Despite thorough searches, the police could not locate the gun, leaving the murder weapon a mystery in the case. During the interrogation, Marco attempted to justify his actions, claiming the killing was a spontaneous act driven by suspicions of Melinda's infidelity. However, the evidence collected by investigators painted a different picture. Marco's deliberate disabling of Melinda's payroll card, his waiting in the trailer with a loaded gun, and his history of systematic threats all pointed to a premeditated murder. Another disturbing discovery during the investigation was that Marco had intentionally left a propane stove on in the Lake City house. This posed a risk of exploding the entire home, potentially damaging neighboring properties and endangering innocent lives. When questioned about this, Marco claimed he had considered with the gas, but ultimately chose to carry out his plan to kill Melinda instead. June 2021 marked the moment when justice was finally served for Melinda Kern, nearly 2 years after her tragic death. However, the trial unfolded in a way that neither the victim's family nor the community expected. Instead of a full trial with intense debates between prosecutors and defense attorneys, Marco Deshawn Clark made a surprising decision. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder at the Craighead County Circuit Court in Arkansas. Marco's guilty plea drastically altered the trial's course. It meant there would be no lengthy debates about motive, no calling of witnesses to clarify the case's circumstances, and no opportunity for the victim's family to hear detailed explanations of why Melinda died so brutally. Instead, the trial became a relatively brief administrative procedure to formally record the guilty plea and issue the sentence. Although there was no full trial, the evidence collected during the investigation played a critical role in demonstrating the severity of Marco's crime. The testimony of Melinda's aunt, who witnessed the entire event from her window, was considered one of the most significant pieces of evidence. She described in detail how Marco appeared, how Melinda tried to flee and screamed for help, and how he coldly shot her in broad daylight. The threatening videos Marco posted on Melinda's Facebook account after the murder were undeniable evidence of his ruthless mindset. In these videos, he not only confessed to killing Melinda, but also threatened to kill others, showing no remorse and even seeming proud of his actions. Reports of Marco's prior violent behavior, filed by Melinda with the police, were also presented as evidence of a systematic and escalating pattern of abuse. These reports detailed how Marco had placed a gun in Melinda's mouth, strangled her, forced her to kneel on the bathroom floor, and issued horrific threats to dismember her if she tried to leave him. All of this pointed to a deliberate pattern of behavior aimed at controlling and ultimately destroying the victim. Throughout the trial preparations, Marco tried to argue that the murder was not premeditated, claiming it was a spontaneous act driven by suspicions of Melinda's infidelity. However, the evidence collected by investigators thoroughly debunked this claim. Marco's deliberate disabling of Melinda's payroll card to lure her back to the house demonstrated a carefully calculated plan. His actions of waiting in the trailer with open windows and a loaded Taurus handgun further proved that he had meticulously prepared to kill Melinda. This was not a spontaneous argument escalating to violence, but a premeditated ambush with a clear intent to murder. These details convinced both the prosecutors and likely Marco's defense attorney that arguing for a lesser charge would be futile. Marco's decision to plead guilty may have been driven by several motives. First, he may have realized the evidence against him was overwhelming and indisputable. With direct witness testimony, self-incriminating social media videos, and evidence of premeditation, his chances of acquittal were virtually non-existent. Second, pleading guilty may have been part of a plea deal with prosecutors to avoid a harsher sentence, particularly the death penalty. While no official confirmation exists from public sources, in the U.S. justice system, guilty pleas often involve negotiations about sentencing. It's possible that Marco and his attorney reached an agreement with prosecutors that, by pleading guilty to first-degree murder, he would avoid the death penalty and instead receive life imprisonment without parole. The trial's outcome was that Marco Clark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest penalty he could receive short of the death penalty. This sentence ensured that Marco would never be free, never able to harm anyone else, and would spend the rest of his life behind bars. However, Marco Clark's ultimate fate took an unexpected turn. Just a few months after his sentencing, in April 2021, Marco died in prison. The cause of his death was not widely disclosed in public sources, but it marked the definitive end of the story of the man who took Melinda Kern's life. Marco's death in prison could be seen as a fitting conclusion to such a bloody case. He would never have the chance to be released, to inflict further pain on Melinda's family, or to carry out the threats he had made about finding and killing others. Justice was served, though not in the way many had anticipated. Although no defense arguments were presented in court due to Marco's guilty plea, the case left behind critical lessons about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of protecting victims. Melinda's death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a warning to society about the devastating consequences of failing to intervene in time to stop abusers. The murder of Melinda Kern left deep scars on her family and friends, especially her aunt, who witnessed the tragedy, and those who saw Melinda as a gift from heaven. Despite doing everything to protect herself, obtaining a protective order, switching cars, fleeing from Marco, her efforts were not enough to save her from an obsessive abuser. The failure to serve the protective order and the system's delays contributed to the tragedy, leaving the community questioning what more could have been done to protect people like Melinda. The case serves as a painful reminder of the dangers in abusive relationships, especially when victims attempt to break free